Hey, what's up? It's Brian and Jeremy from IGN, and this has been a fantastic, big, giant, loud month for live-action Star Wars stuff. We got the end of the Skywalker saga with Episode 9, Rise of Skywalker, and also The Mandalorian's wrapping up. And so this has been like a really cool time to be a Star Wars fan.
That's before you even count the games and everything.
Everything else, yeah. But invariably, we have to debate things here in the space of nerdom, and I think the more we think about it, I think we're both starting to realize that The Mandalorian and stuff like it might be a better storytelling device for the Star Wars universe than these giant movies. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. And so a lot of our friends here have been sort of split on The Mandalorian about whether or not it's corny and whether or not it lives up to, like, it's got a pretty high budget, but sometimes it looks like a Stargate or something.
It does feel like a Stargate or like a Xena warrior princess. I think it's because they're using a combination of digital sets and some props and stuff like that. But there's also like they're going for more of a TV feel. There's less sort of like star-studded side characters. One of the big complaints is that a lot of the sort of like secondary actors aren't great. The writing isn't that great, but that sort of feels like 70s, early 80s Star Wars.
That's true to the spirit of the original movies. Like, if you go back and watch them, it's not like the performances are Oscar-worthy.
No, especially in A New Hope.
Half of them were embarrassed by it.
Yeah.
Now, we all loved it because it had so much charm to it. Like, you were talking about the toaster.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, just sort of like, I think that like being scrappier with a budget is what Star Wars is sort of built on. It was George Lucas with the confines of the restraints of having not endless amount of money, but he basically had to say like, oh, how do we make this robot using garbage can?
And he's got a producer, like, for sure, going like, you just can't have this robot. You don't have money for this robot.
Yeah. Whereas the new movies have endless budget and can show you everything. They're also juggling a billion more characters. They have all these like loose ends and plots they have to tie up. Whereas The Mandalorian can basically focus and let scenes sort of cook and marinate and simmer a little bit because they'll work with like 3 or 4 characters an episode. It's also like with the approach to The Mandalorian, which I think people have slowly realized is like not so quietly a fringe X-Files style monster of the week show.
Right.
That has basically like one big bad per episode, and then somewhere kind of hovering underneath is like this through line narrative that will be stretched across the entire
It's almost
season.
like a video game. Like, you have little mini bosses on your way, you're building a party.
You're also like, you're upgrading your armor,
Yeah.
you're getting like missiles and stuff like that. Like, it's totally video gamey, which I actually really dig. But yeah, I think that really feels like much more in line with the original trilogy than the new movies, which, frankly...
They're too sophisticated.
Yes.
They're too slick. There's too much exposition. It's painted itself into a corner that The Mandalorian just doesn't have to.
Yeah.
And you're kind of touching on a couple things here that I think are very interesting. One is, working within the constraints of a budget that's 4 or 5 times less than what the movie would be, they have to be a little bit more creative.
Yeah.
Right? And if you're told, like, hey, you got to make a robot out of putting a toaster on a broomstick and walking him around, like, there's something really charming about that. And I think growing up, we were all like, hey, that's great.
I mean,
good job, you did it.
One of people's favorite Star Wars characters, really big, of 2 Star Wars nerds' favorite Star Wars characters, is this guy named Wilro Hood, who is seen in the back of one shot holding an ice cream maker. And this is in the original trilogy, and they gave him a name, they gave him a backstory and everything. And that ice cream maker appears in The Mandalorian as basically the container for all the Beskar steel, which is a super interesting nod. But some of the best art in history has been created under the restraints and constraints of not only budget, but time and everything else.
Yeah, and if a small group of people have to work together really closely, they tend to put a little bit more love and care into like each individual like monster and creature and droid. They all have whether this is true or not, we were kind of raised to believe that every single character you saw had a backstory that was like motivated. And they get, the movies linger on them.
And so that's the thing. We're not going to spoil anything in the Rise of Skywalker movie, but you've probably by now seen a lot of the sort of running narrative from the audience saying it's a very busy movie. It is incredibly cluttered in terms of like, it doesn't really allow a lot of scenes to breathe or cook.
They just move through everything so quickly. Like, it's basically the main difference being when you see a monster or an alien or a robot in these new movies, it's designed by a committee of 20 or 30 art design executives who are making $350,000 each and have unlimited budget, and like they're just like, here it is. and
You see him for half a second.
Yeah. It doesn't. I don't know.
Whereas like the second episode of The Mandalorian was basically a boss fight. It was just him being like, I got to get this egg from this big beast, this rhino cow, and then bring it back to the Jawas.
But everything about it, you know, in The Mandalorian it is a little bit corny because they're using puppets and you know, makeup and costumes and all this stuff, and it's very it's realistic and visceral, but
it's scrappy.
You can see the seams of it. You know, the damn armor suit that he's wearing, he can't even walk like a normal person in it. He's all
just
stiff.
you know. No, it works really well.
I love that. Like it feels like a real tactile thing as opposed to, you know, just all of the fake visual effects that we see in the 90s prequels and also in these new movies.
I totally agree. It's also TV as a medium to sort of bookend this conversation. I think it's like a fantastic vessel for narratives like this because you can allow things to stretch out and cook. You can ebb and flow in terms of how long you want something to be. This movie, the new movie, could have been 3 hours or 4 hours or 5 hours, but on a TV show, you can basically say, hey, the first season's 8 episodes. The second season is 12, and each one's 50 minutes. Why not?
It can be whatever it wants to be.
Yeah, and it gives your characters a lot of room to breathe, and your stories a lot of space to grow. You can also sort of adapt to where the audience is going. A lot of TV shows in history have famously latched onto like characters that people have really connected with. Something like Breaking Bad.
Why wouldn't you?
Yeah. Breaking Bad originally wanted to kill Jesse off early, and people connected with him. The writers loved him, and all of a sudden, you can't imagine that show without him. And then El Camino, which, you know, is the epilogue to that entire saga, is entirely focused on him. It's his film. And so I think that you have that opportunity with television, with The Mandalorian, with Boba Fett, the Obi-Wan Kenobi show coming out. I think you have a great opportunity there to tell stories that the movies don't really allow right now, at least in a trilogy structure.
That's another really good point that you're making is, you know, we have now become really accustomed to viewing things. We're living in a peak television moment.
Yeah.
The television shows that we're getting right now are just like head and shoulders above anything we've ever seen before. And I think movies are struggling to find a way to tell stories that have anywhere near the amount of depth that like a Fargo would.
Oh God, yeah.
You know, or something like this. And they struggle with it. And the best movies, to me, seem to be recently the ones that just don't even try to do that, and they instead just pick 2 or 3 characters to focus on. Like,
right. Or you look at like the MCU, which has been incredibly phenomenal at sort of nailing the cadence of this large sweeping narrative. But that is like sort of like we're ultimately funneling in the theaters to watch 4 or 5 TV show episodes a year. And they're huge blockbuster TV shows, but those are TV shows. Like those are like something like Avengers Endgame felt like a season finale. They almost
really embrace it more
and I love them for that.
Than Star Wars seems to be able to do.
Yeah, I totally agree. Because Star Wars movies have become this sort of event, and now they have so much stuff. 42 years of films have to fit into one, whereas a TV show can kind of like chill.
In the context of Star Wars, though, doesn't it really just come down to the puppets?
I think so.
And the little suits and everything.
Yeah.
Like every time I see a person holding the Baby Yoda puppet,
yep,
it's just like it's so clearly a puppet.
Yeah,
I love it so much.
And I love that.
Like, they look so ridiculous doing it, but it's more real than if they were pretending to do that with like a CG character. They're holding like a green egg with dots on it or something.
Some of my favorite art has been created through constraints like that. Like I was telling you before we started shooting this video that Super Mario, the entire reason he has a mustache is because in 8-bit they tried to give him a mouth and it looked terrifying, so they like put a mustache there. And now you cannot imagine that character without it. In fact, when you see photoshops of him missing it, you feel deeply unsettled.
It's not okay.
Yeah.
I don't want to see that.
Yeah. Xbox Live Arcade famously had an incredibly small file size, which constrained developers and forced them.
They were limited. They had to be within a certain file size.
They had to do wizardry to make it fit into this tiny little thing, and now all bets are off. You download a game that's like 150 gigs, and it doesn't matter.
Now
anymore.
It's hard to know even what to focus on. Like, what's good? It's like if everything, there's just it's almost too much.
Yeah. So let us know. Do you think The Mandalorian works for being sort of like corny and hokey and a little like shoestring at times, or do you think movies are ultimately the best way to tell these gigantic sweeping saga stories across generations? I think it's a mix of both, but I'm leaning towards TV.
These 2 leather daddies are for TV.
Thank you so much for watching, and for all things Star Wars, may the Force be with you right here on IGN.